Back in the day, a 20 by 40 foot garden could keep a whole family fed through the toughest years. This little garden was a masterpiece of resourcefulness. Your grandparents used buckets to grow potatoes. Fence boards became garden beds, and coffee grounds fed the soil. Every part of the garden had a job, and every harvest proved that these simple methods could feed a family without waste or struggle. Here's how your grandparents fed their whole family with a 20 by 40 foot garden. Number 15. Planting 1 celery per week. Celery was one of the trickiest crops in a small garden, but your grandparents grew it like clockwork, 52 plants a year, 1 for each week. They didn't plant all at once. Instead, they started small batches every few days so that harvests were steady instead of overwhelming. The early seedlings went into the shadiest spots, where the soil stayed damp and cool. Celery demanded attention, regular watering, rich soil, and gentle feeding. But once established, it gave a crisp yield that lasted long into winter. They cut stalks from the outside while the inner hearts kept growing, stretching the harvest even further. Some stalks went straight into stews or pickling jars, while the leaves were dried for seasoning. Others were blanched by mounding soil or wrapping them in paper to soften the flavor. Nothing went to waste. Even the roots were left to break down in place, feeding the next crop. This slow, deliberate system ensured a constant supply of fresh greens without ever overcrowding the garden. This method can also be applied to growing other crops like lettuce, kale, and Swiss chard. Number 14. Dual-purpose plant waste. In a self-sufficient garden, nothing was ever truly thrown out. Old stalks, pulled weeds, and tired vines all had another job waiting. Your grandparents knew that even garden waste could feed something else. Pea vines, carrot tops, and outer cabbage leaves were tossed to the chickens, who scratched them apart and turned them into eggs, manure, and compost-ready material. The birds ate what they liked and trampled the rest into the bedding. When the coop was cleaned, that mix of straw, droppings, and scraps became the foundation for next season's fertilizer. This cycle meant the garden fed the animals, and the animals fed the garden. No outside inputs needed. Even crops too damaged for the table went into this loop. It saved money, reduced waste, and built richer soil year after year. The process wasn't glamorous, but it worked flawlessly. Every bucket of scraps carried from the garden eventually came back as nourishment, completing a closed system that kept the soil fertile and the harvests steady. Number 13. Succession planting. A 20 by 40 foot garden could feed a whole family only if it never stopped producing. Your grandparents didn't leave soil bare after a harvest. They replanted right away. When the green beans finished, carrots took their place. Once carrots came out, spinach or broccoli followed. It was a constant handoff between crops with no empty beds waiting for attention. This kept the soil active, the moisture balanced, and the food supply steady through every season. Seeds for the next planting were started early, often while the current crop was still ripening. That way, transplants were ready the moment space opened up. Even pulled plants weren't wasted. Their roots were turned under to feed the ground for what came next. This system turned a small space into a continuous loop of growth. Spring harvests rolled into summer, and fall crops carried the family through winter. By using every day of the growing season, they turned a modest patch of dirt into a steady supply line of fresh food that never ran out. Number 12. Interplanting. A small garden didn't have room for wide rows or empty gaps. To make the most of every inch, your grandparents mixed plants that worked well together. Tall crops like corn and tomatoes gave shade to tender greens below. Beans twined up their stalks, fixing nitrogen that fed the soil for everything around them. Root vegetables like carrots grew quietly under low-spreading herbs, while onions lined the edges to keep pests away. This layering wasn't decoration, it was function. Each plant helped another by trading shade, nutrients, or protection. The result was a compact patch that looked busy but stayed healthy and balanced. Weeds had no room to grow, moisture lasted longer, and harvests stretched through the whole season. They didn't waste time on perfect spacing or uniform rows. They watched how plants behaved and paired them naturally. A bed might hold 6 crops at once, all thriving in their own small corner. In a small garden, interplanting wasn't a fancy technique. It was survival through efficiency, turning one piece of ground into a living system where nothing stood idle. Number 11. Vertical trellising. When space was limited, growing upward was the smartest move a gardener could make. Your grandparents didn't see fences or poles as barriers. They saw them as ladders for food. Anything with a climbing habit, beans, peas, cucumbers, and even certain melons, was trained to reach for the sky instead of sprawling across the ground. This one change turned a small plot into something closer to a 3-dimensional farm. Tall trellises made from sticks, saplings, or bits of wire carried the weight of the vines, while the ground below stayed open for low-growing crops like lettuce, spinach, or herbs. The mix created layers of productivity that worked together instead of competing. Every square foot pulled double duty. Sun-hungry plants took the top tier, while the shaded soil beneath stayed cool and moist. Fruit stayed cleaner, pests had fewer hiding spots, and harvesting became easier since everything hung within reach. The supports themselves were reused each season, tied back together with twine or nails scavenged from the shed. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. At full growth, those trellised rows looked like living walls of green beans hanging in bunches, vines weaving through air, and the soil below quietly feeding another crop. A simple frame and a bit of planning doubled what a small garden could produce. Number 10. Compact varieties. A big yield didn't always require a big garden. Your grandparents knew that some crops gave more per inch than others, so they chose compact varieties that packed productivity into small spaces. Bush beans replaced long, vining types. Short carrots and stubby beets filled shallow beds without overcrowding. Determinate tomatoes grew to a set height, loaded themselves with fruit, and stopped. No endless tangles to prune or tie. Even corn had dwarf strains bred for tight rows. Each choice came from experience and a clear goal to get the most food possible from limited soil. These smaller plants matured faster and could be planted closer together, making the most of every square foot. They also used less water and resisted wind damage better than taller varieties. The garden might have looked humble, but it was efficient down to the last inch. Seeds were swapped between neighbors until families found strains perfectly suited to their soil and weather. With compact crops filling every bed, it was possible to grow a full pantry's worth of produce without ever leaving the backyard. A tiny garden built this way didn't just feed a family. It proved that smart selection and tight planting could outperform a much larger plot managed without care. Number 9. Perennial Edges. A smart gardener knew the value of crops that came back on their own. Along the edges of that 20 by 40 foot plot, your grandparents planted perennials, plants that didn't need replanting every year but quietly returned stronger each season. Walking onions were a favorite, multiplying on their own until the borders looked alive with green shoots. Strawberries spread runners that crept between stones and rows, giving bowls of fruit with almost no effort. Asparagus filled one corner, slow to start but rewarding for years once established. These plants acted like the garden's backbone. They marked the boundaries, fed pollinators early in the season, and made sure there was always something edible growing, even when annual beds were being turned over. The best part was their resilience. Perennials handled dry spells, cold snaps, and neglect better than most vegetables, quietly holding the soil in place and enriching it year after year. Each spring, while other crops were still in seed trays, those border plants were already stretching toward the sun. They provided food without demanding much in return, a steady foundation that anchored the garden and gave a head start on every new season's work. Number 8. Seasonal rotation. Feeding a family from a small garden meant planning for every temperature change. Crops had to shift with the seasons, not fight them. Your grandparents mastered that cycle through rotation: warm season plants in summer, cool season ones in fall and spring, and cover crops or mulch through winter. Beans and tomatoes thrived in the heat, while carrots, broccoli, and spinach took over when the air cooled. It wasn't just about timing harvests, it was about keeping the soil balanced. Different plants pulled different nutrients, so rotating them prevented exhaustion, and disease beds that held heavy feeders one year were given legumes the next to restore nitrogen naturally. Each shift followed a simple pattern that made the small space act like a living system, always renewing itself. The rotation also broke pest cycles, leaving fewer problems for the next planting. It was quiet efficiency at its best. Instead of pushing the land harder, they worked with it, matching every seed to its season and letting nature set the pace. That's how a small garden kept producing year after year without wearing itself out. Number 7. Underground crops for hidden yield. A tiny garden could only feed a household if every layer of soil was used wisely. Your grandparents didn't stop at surface crops. They grew a second harvest. Underground carrots, beets, parsnips, and Jerusalem artichokes filled the lower levels, while greens and herbs occupied the top. Each root crop had a role: carrots for storage, beets for pickling, and artichokes for their unbeatable resilience. Through cold months, beneath the surface, those tubers kept the ground loose and aerated, turning compact soil into rich, crumbly earth for the next planting. These hidden crops were also natural storage. They stayed fresh right where they grew until the family needed them. Harvesting was easy. No crates, no cellars, just a spade and patience. The beds might look bare in winter, but below the frost, food waited. Even after the tops withered, the roots kept well into the new year, proof that a small garden could hold more than it showed. Planting layers in depth as well as height meant that every square foot worked twice, making the soil itself part of the harvest. Number 6. Intensive bed use. A small garden succeeded only when every inch counted. Rows were close, corners were filled, and nothing was left idle. Your grandparents treated the garden like a puzzle, fitting crops together so that light, moisture, and nutrients were shared instead of wasted. Lettuce grew between slower plants like cabbage. Radishes filled gaps that would otherwise sit empty. Beds were broad, never trampled, and paths stayed narrow to keep more ground productive. Compost and mulch were added after each harvest so the soil could handle constant planting without wearing out. Even the smallest strip by a fence or path might hold onions, herbs, or quick greens. It was careful planning, but not complicated, just the kind of work that rewarded attention. Over time, the garden became dense with life, buzzing with insects and shaded by overlapping leaves. That space acted more like a mini farm than a backyard plot. Every harvest rolled into the next, and every bed carried its weight. Nothing went to waste, not even the soil underfoot, and that simple efficiency kept the family's pantry full long after the growing season ended. Number 5. Soil renewal between crops. The secret to endless harvests in a small garden wasn't just planting, it was restoring the soil between every crop. Your grandparents never left the ground tired. After each harvest, they turned in compost made from kitchen scraps, old plants, and chicken bedding. A broad fork loosened the compacted layers without flipping them, letting air and water reach deep down where the roots would grow. Next, they sometimes scattered wood ash for minerals or laid down straw to hold moisture through dry spells. Every addition was done with purpose. Feed the soil first, and it would feed everything else. Over time, the garden beds grew darker, softer, and richer. Worms worked through the layers all winter, keeping the earth alive. This constant renewal meant no need for chemical fertilizers, just patience and recycling. The ground became a living pantry, full of nutrients waiting for the next crop to draw from. That's how a small patch could carry season after season of heavy harvests without wearing out healthy soil, was the engine of the whole system, quietly working beneath the surface long after the last shovel of compost was spread. Number 4. Using natural mulch for soil and storage. Fallen leaves were never considered waste in a working garden. Your grandparents gathered them each autumn, piled them high, and turned them into insulation, fertilizer, and even a planting bed. When the ground cooled, potatoes were scattered over the surface and buried beneath thick layers of shredded leaves. Over the winter, the pile held in warmth and moisture, sheltering the tubers until shoots pushed through. In spring, it was nature's blanket, free, effective, and silent. The same mulch later broke down into dark, crumbly humus that improved the soil for next season's crops. Nothing fancy, no store-bought compost or fertilizer, just patience and leaves doing what they were meant to do. Even during summer, a thin covering of mulch around vegetables kept the soil from drying out and blocked weeds from stealing nutrients. The result was less watering, fewer weeds, and healthier plants with almost no extra work. In a small garden, where every bit of space mattered, this approach turned what others raked away into one of the most powerful tools for productivity and soil care. Number 3. Adaptive rotation planning. Gardens don't stay the same from year to year, and your grandparents never expected them to. When a crop failed because of pests, too much shade, or poor drainage, they didn't see it as a loss. They saw it as information. Beds were adjusted, rows shifted, and crops swapped based on what the land had shown them. If beans struggled under a tree's shadow, that corner became a lettuce patch the next spring. If the soil turned heavy after too many root crops, they planted peas or clover to loosen it naturally. Each change built on the lessons of the last season, refining the layout without ever wasting space. Over time, every section of that tiny garden had a specific job that suited its light, slope, and texture perfectly. The rotation wasn't random, it was responsive. By letting the garden dictate what worked, they avoided repeating mistakes and kept harvests reliable. This flexibility turned trial and error into quiet efficiency, ensuring that even small plots stayed productive through unpredictable weather and shifting soil conditions. Nothing stayed static, and that constant tweaking was the reason food came out of the same ground year after year. Number 2. Quick cycle greens. Fast-growing greens were the safety net of every small garden. They filled empty spaces, fed the household often, and never asked for much in return. After a big crop came out, like cabbage, potatoes, or onions, your grandparents planted quick growers such as lettuce, spinach, mustard, or arugula. These crops sprouted in days and matured in weeks, giving salad greens and cooking leaves before slower vegetables even settled in. Their shallow roots meant they could grow beside deeper crops without competing, making them perfect fillers between rows or under taller plants. Even the narrow paths between beds sometimes doubled as greens patches. Frequent harvesting encouraged regrowth, turning one sowing into several cuttings before replanting nothing matched their speed or efficiency. A few handfuls of seed could keep the table full of fresh greens all year long. In a tiny garden, that speed mattered. Each quick harvest gave time for the next big one to mature. It was a cycle of constant return, proof that small spaces didn't need to rest when quick crops could keep them busy and productive between the main harvests. Number 1. Staggered seed starts. A small garden only worked if harvests came in waves, not floods. Your grandparents managed that by starting seeds in stages, just a few trays every couple of weeks instead of planting everything at once. It kept food steady instead of overwhelming. Broccoli, lettuce, and spinach were the favorites for this approach, easy to start indoors or under cold frames, while older plants were still finishing outside. By the time one bed cleared, the next batch was already strong enough to transplant. This meant there were no long gaps between harvests, no empty ground waiting for something to grow. Even in poor weather, seedlings could be held back safely until the soil warmed or the rain passed. Staggered starts also reduced the risk of total loss. If one batch failed, the next was right behind it. The method turned a single planting season into a rolling schedule of growth that lasted months. Each new tray represented another week of meals ahead, proving that timing and patience mattered as much as soil and sunlight. In a small garden, this simple planning kept food coming without waste and made every week feel like the peak of summer. Which of these old methods do you think would still keep a modern family fed today? Let us know in the comments below. If you learned something new today, make sure to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one.